Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Religious Studies Project once again. I'm David Robertson. And I think I'm Christopher Cotter. And we are counting down the last few weeks before our summer break now. It's exciting. I'm rubbing my hands with glue as we speak. This week, however, we have a very interesting interview for you which was recorded for us by our good friend Hannah Lettinen, a long-term member of the team here at the Religious Studies Project. And it's an interview with Mirjam Mencej on witchcraft in rural Slovenia. So, very interesting, and I'm going to pass over to Hannah.
So, welcome to Religious Studies Project. My name is Hannah Lehtinen, and we are currently in Turku. It's early morning, and it's relatively cloudy. And with me is Mirjam Mencej from the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. And she is the professor of folklore studies at the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology there. And her accomplishments include, but are not limited to, numerous articles and 6 published monographs on various topics related to vernacular religion, folklore, and witchcraft, which is what we will be discussing here today. Professor Mentzey's latest volume that will be out later this year is called Styrian Witches in European Perspective, and it's based on her ethnographical work in the rural areas of Eastern Slovenia, and it deals with witchcraft from a variety of angles. So welcome, Mirjam, and it's great to have you here today.
Morning, thank you for inviting me.
So we might just begin with witchcraft. As we saw yesterday, the lecture was a huge success. So witchcraft probably brings up lots of different images and ideas of what are we exactly dealing with. But how would you define witchcraft in the context of your own work?
Okay, yeah, well, first let me answer the first part of your question. Yeah. Indeed, witchcraft nowadays appears in many guises. It has become a commodity, really. Witches flood the movies, the internet, the journals, the books, even cookbooks. Women dress up as witches to partake at Halloween parties. And actually it has become a trademark of radical feminism, etc. But all this witchcraft has nothing to do really what traditional witchcraft is about, and which I actually researched in the Styrian area of Slovenia and gave the lecture on yesterday. Traditional witchcraft was typically set in more or less small-scale, close-knit, face-to-face agriculture communities. And witchcraft, in fact, served as an explanation of misfortune, interpreting the source of personal misfortunes as a consequence of others' malevolent agency. So the basic premise in witchcraft is actually that the origin of misfortune is social, and the person responsible for misfortune is understood to be the witch. Now, when misfortune occurred, people usually seek culprits amongst their close neighbors or in their immediate vicinity, in their immediate environment, and especially close neighbors were particularly feared in this regard. In most ethnographic areas, sometimes also foreigners feature as witchcraft, but this is much less typical than the neighbors, particularly close neighbors. And it was basically their envy that was particularly feared, and actually they represented a constant threat of possible misfortune.
Yeah. And how did you end up studying witchcraft, actually?
This was more or less by accident. I mean, in summer 2000, I arrived with a group of my students to a secluded rural region in Slovenian Styria. I mean, Styria is a wider region, really. This was a part of Styrian region. And our aim was to conduct fieldwork in order to help the local institutions' mission to promote the local heritage, really. So what I hoped for were basically etiological legends related to some features of landscape, or some buildings in the region, etc. Yet, knowing that these kind of legends tend to be rarer than the so-called belief narratives, belief legends, I also instructed my students to ask about witchcraft and the dead and supernatural in general. Now, when the groups met in the evening to share the results after the first day of fieldwork and also all the following evenings, one thing became clear. That is that the topic in the region was actually witchcraft. And so after that, we just continued to focus on witchcraft. And actually really encountered plenty of people who still believed in witchcraft, and some even still practiced witchcraft, although we never witnessed any of the practices. But obviously, some people still buried bones or eggs to their neighbor's property in order to do them harm. And some people even still understood witchcraft as an institution. Actually, they relied on witchcraft as an institution explaining the misfortunes that befell them.
Exactly. And this area where you were conducting the study, could you describe it a little bit? So it's a very remote
actually
area?
This is a very remote area with poor traffic connections. The farms are small, the land divided into small parcels, and the people mainly engage in subsistence agriculture. Our interlocutors were actually mainly old people, because mostly older people still live there. Younger generation just moved into the cities, usually migrate somewhere. And in fact, this is the region that is in the frames of Slovenia is still a synonym for backwardness and remoteness and poverty, really. But the region where we were doing fieldwork was even more impoverished until the 70s. The 70s brought some changes into the life of the population. For instance, electricity and water supply became available to more households than before. Many houses were rebuilt. Free medical care became available even to farmers. And several factories and tourism facilities were established at the periphery of the region. And this actually offered some job opportunities to people living in the region, which consequently triggered daily migrations of part of the population, and also the improvement of the roads and traffic facilities. And better roads also allowed for the use of tractors, which improved agricultural yields, etc. This was also the time when the television started to make its way into rural households. And all these changes consequently triggered the loosening of the bonds of the close village communities. And actually change the social life in the villages. Now, in our area, the key setting for the communication of witchcraft narratives, and also the basic context within which these narratives were narrated and evaluated, was always shared work. You know, the time when people gathered together in this or that house to shell beans or pluck feathers, husk corn, and do similar works. And with these economic changes and other changes like television, etc., this basic key setting was over. You know, there was no such thing as a common work in the evenings, and this consequently actually caused the witchcraft discourse to start losing its adherence and communal support. So people did not have this framework anymore within which they could discuss witchcraft. I mean, they obviously still managed to find ways to tell narratives about witchcraft and even to practice some sort of magical practices, but this basic setting was over, and they could not talk publicly about it as they used to do before, right?
So it wasn't quite as accepted anymore, perhaps, as an explanation?
Not generally accepted,
exactly.
Really. They definitely were still able to talk about it within the family circles or with, some of the neighbors that still believed in witchcraft, but it was not, it was not an overt practice to discuss it anymore.
So when you said that witchcraft sort of struck you when you were doing the fieldwork as something really to focus on. So did people talk about it very openly, or was there some reservation to?
Generally people, yes. Generally they had no problems talking about witchcraft overtly. Although some did try to somehow hide their belief from me or the students, at least at the beginning of the interview. They would usually start, not usually, but they would often start they're talking about witchcraft like, no, I never heard about witchcraft, I don't believe in witchcraft, and similar. But then after a while, they would just tell you, a great story about their own involvement in witchcraft, or their discovery of bewitching item, or their visit of a fortune teller who acted as an unwitcher in the region, and so on. So, like Jean Favre-Sada, who wrote a fascinating book on French witchcraft, understands this as a kind of reconciliation between their witchcraft discourse and their assumed rational discourse of the researcher, as a way how to reconcile these two, at least at the beginning of the interview. But usually, there was no problem really. It was quite the topic that cropped more or less by itself. We didn't really expect it to be there, to find it.
Yeah. We already touched upon this, but perhaps again. So, how would you define witchcraft in this context? What is it, and what is a witch, really?
Yeah, well, as I said, basically the answer you would get from anthropological research would be a witch is a person who is considered to be doing, to use some supernatural means to do harm to others, right? So basically the idea is that witchcraft is a social thing. The origin of witchcraft is social. If a misfortune befalls you, basically there's a human being, usually from the same community, that was supposed to cause it, right? But in fact, in our region, I actually defined in my book various layers of witchcraft and various types of witches. And I think one should actually pay attention during the research to different types of witches, because if you don't, the answers can be a bit confusing. Well, basically, I would say, there is this social layer of witchcraft that anthropologists often research, but within it, one could actually distinguish between a neighborhood witch, or which I call a neighborhood witch, some would probably call it social witch, and the village witch that some researchers called scapegoat witch. Now, there is a difference between these two. While neighborhood witch was mostly blamed for the misfortunes that befell the neighbor, so, you assumed your neighbor caused the misfortune that befell you by either, for instance, burying bones or eggs to your property, or by praising your child or your livestock, etc. There are various modes of bewitching, really, and I can discuss that later, perhaps. But anyway, on the other hand, the village witch was not necessarily blamed for any misfortune, although some village witches, of course, get a reputation based on the general consensus of their harmful activities, usually born out of envy, which is typical for the neighborhood witch. But there were also other reasons that have nothing to do with this accusation of causing misfortunes, and are more or less related to some stereotypical notions about a witch, like, if she looked ugly, or bent, curved, old, of course. This already was a strong sign that she could be a witch. Or, moreover, if she behaved quarrelsome, if she quarreled a lot, if she was inquisitive, this was even more likely to cause a reputation. If the family if her family was proclaimed to be kind of related to witchcraft, like, for instance, if her mother already had such a reputation, the reputation was likely passed over to her daughter, because it was also generally believed that a mother transmits her knowledge to her daughter. Or if the father owned a magic book, and it was usually men who were believed to have these books, his daughter would also kind of inherit such a reputation. And sometimes they would even judge about who the village witch is according to the way she died. So a person could acquire a reputation even after her death, like if something unusual happened during the funeral or something, she was likely, recognized as a witch afterwards. Or also any extra knowledge, something that others would not know, but she allegedly knew immediately, also could cause the reputation. So this was actually the social layer of witchcraft. But there was another layer which I would tentatively call supernatural layer, that anthropologists often skipped from their research. And it was also not always necessarily present in the regions where the fieldwork was done, because these witches that I call night witches, because they usually appear at night, often in the shape of some flickering lights, sometimes invisible, and usually causing people to lose their orientation, to get totally disoriented in the forest, to get lost. Often the same deeds and the same shapes, the same appearance refer to fairies or the souls of the dead or any other supernatural entities within the European folklore. Anyway, in our region, they were always called witches. And while they did not do any economic damage, they were still blamed for the misfortune, just of another type. They caused people to lose their way, to spend the night in forest. And they were sometimes subsequently recognized as a certain person from the community. Not always, but sometimes people would say, yes, I recognize those witches that looked like lights, it's always plural, during the night. And then, the next day they would scold her or even threaten them and similar. So there are differences, and there are differences in the discourses between these social and supernatural layers. There are differences in the manner of protection, in the attitudes toward different witches. Also, the attitude toward the neighborhood witch and the village witch was different, right? Etc. So many differences, and yet, people would talk about witches in the same breath. If you ask them about witchcraft, they could either answer with the response that referred to neighborhood village or night witches.
Yeah. And well, it seems pretty obvious also from general depictions of witches, and also from what you're saying that witches were often somehow considered to be women, or it was to do with women.
Yes, it was mostly women. Actually, in our region, it was mostly women, except for in basically one category of village witch. You could also encounter men. As I said, those were those men basically that possessed or allegedly possessed, because one couldn't check, right, the magic book. These were mostly men. And men could sometimes appear as witches also when they severely transgressed some social norms, like, in case of blasphemy or cursing and drinking heavily. But this was really seldom. Mostly it was women, yes.
Could you think up any reasons why it would be?
Well, actually, this is quite this got some historical roots. Witches were always related to women. Were always related to witchcraft. Baroja, Spanish researcher, actually says that this idea that witches women are connected to night and moon, but also to magic, are the ideas that spread up already in antiquity. So there is a strong connection in these notions, in traditional ideas, I would say. But also, during the witch trials, several historians pointed out that women were often regarded as somehow more prone to be able to be seduced by a devil. They were weaker and actually, all these accusations, in fact, somehow reflected the misogyny of the period, right? Also, women were often proclaimed witches when they were old already, when they were in the period of menopause, which was related to the idea about menstruation. That until they still have their menstruation, they could kind of purify themselves, and afterwards they could not do that anymore. So this bad fluids, just prevailed in their bodies, and there are many reasons. And of course, widows and unmarried women were among the first targets of accusations. Also, one thing, because their status were unclear, and in the early modern period, the idea about a woman was to be married, to have a man by their side. Is this strong patriarchal approach, or look at the role of the woman in the society. But on the other hand, it was also their weaker position in this case, right? They had no social cure. They did not have a husband who would perhaps protect them in this regard, against the gossip, against the accusations.
Yeah, exactly. So it was also these witchcraft accusations could also act as a very powerful tool for social control.
Definitely, yes. And actually, the narratives themselves acted as a way of social control. People try to behave not the way that they could possibly be accused of witchcraft, right? So, yes, definitely, this was one way to look at. This is one way to look at witchcraft too.
Yeah. Another interesting category that you bring up in your work is the so-called unwitchers. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us a little bit about them and how they belong into this dynamic of the witchcraft discourse or accusations?
Well, yes. Well, unwitchers, or some would probably call them counter witches, or unbewitcher, one also read, were an important figure in this triangle, a victim, a witch, and an unwitcher. In our region, it was fortune tellers that actually acted as unwitchers, in the sense that they could counteract the bewitchment, and act in the direction to identify the witch responsible for misfortune. Now, people would usually address unwitchers in case that, many misfortunes happened on very different areas of their life or household, etc. And unwitchers would actually the first step in their procedure would usually be to proclaim the misfortune as a result of witchcraft. And in their further steps, they would usually try to annihilate the bewitchment by various instructions that they gave to their clients, and to identify the witch, because the identification was crucial in this regard. It allowed the client to face their opponents, to materialize something that was abstract beforehand. And in the end, they also offered a possibility of the redirection of this bewitchment or the evil back to its source, which of course people usually denied to accept. Yeah, well, but basically in my book, I argued that the main role of unwitcher was in helping, especially women, to in one thing was to help them in the times of economic insecurity, when their households were not prospering. But the basic thing, I think, was to help women maintain their social positions, their social position in times it was endangered, because women were basically evaluated according to their work, how they managed to do the household works, were they successful in this regard, and if they were not, their social position was strongly threatened. And in this case, they actually needed, I think, at least in our region, that's the way how I understood the situation, they needed the unwitcher to help them transpose, relocate the blame from themselves to the outside witch, or to somebody else, and thus help them maintain their social position in a way, because it was not them then that were to be blamed for the misfortunes that befell the household, but some outsider coming from the other household, coming from the usually the same community, but still not from within the household.
So identifying some kind of enemy or cause of trouble from the outside was very crucial.
Yes,
exactly.
Definitely.
We already mentioned that, if for example the livestock or some other way the livelihood was endangered, mm-hmm. this would be one reason mm-hmm. to suspect witchcraft. Could you mention some other cases or situations where this witchcraft discourse or the accusations of witchcraft even could be mm-hmm. invoked?
Well, the main targets, if I start with this part first, the main targets of bewitchment in our region were livestock, really.
Yeah.
This is a different situation than the one I encountered in Bosnia, where I just recently did 3 months fieldwork, when witchcraft is mostly directed against people, against their well-being and health and jobs, etc. In our region, it was really mostly livestock, sometimes small children, but basically livestock that were the main target of bewitchment. But of course, there were other situations where people can use witchcraft discourse to their benefit, and it was not necessarily related to their personal belief into the proposition. Many situations, many circumstances in many circumstances, witchcraft discourse could be really used for people to save face, for instance, or to give an acceptable explanation to the family or to the community at large. And I can just give you some examples. For instance, when, for instance, a young man was unable to work, to find a job, even to search for a job, a young man who actually withdrew himself from society and probably suffering some sort of a depression or perhaps some mental illness. The explanation by witchcraft, in terms of witchcraft, was actually a suitable explanation at hand for a family to give to the community at large, which probably not understanding the depression as a serious mental state would proclaim him an idler, or perhaps even blame his family for a failed upbringing. And on the other hand, this helped the family to cope with the situation, to understand, to accept their son's position. Also, for instance, when marital quarrels appeared, when a couple quarreled and suddenly, I remember one story told by a certain interlocutor, suddenly when a woman threw his husband out of bed, she said, I at that moment I saw a toad under the bed, and I trampled her, I destroyed her, and the next day I saw a woman in the village, who lost her leg just at the same time. And now this is how they recognized that it was that woman that transformed into the toad, and this was a general notion in our region that witches can either transform into toads or send toads. And actually, she recognized the witch that transformed into a toad by her losing a leg in the same moment. And thus, there are many such circumstances that actually allowed people to use the witchcraft discourse, especially when they transgressed social norms, having spent a night in the forest after night drinking, they could just say, well, witches, night witches carried me away, so I couldn't find the way out of the forest. Or, it could be a cover-up for sexual relationships that were illicit, or it could just reflect sexual fantasies sometimes. I don't know. It was also used as an education means in the upbringing of children, not to, walk into dangerous areas at night, or to prevent people to do illicit things in the night, like meeting others, men and wives. It could even be invoked by workers who wanted to stop work during the night, at 2 a.m. I guess everybody would prepare to stop working already, and they could just, invoke this idea about witches. No, I'm going to go home now because otherwise witches would come, etc. So yes, there were many opportunities for the uses of witchcraft discourse, and this was not really related to, as I said, to one's belief or disbelief in the proposition, and they were not also used intentionally in order to manipulate other people's opinion, but acted more like a spontaneous act based on the habitus, really. Of course, now it could be used also to manipulate public opinion, especially if they gossip others, like. I was told that this witchcraft discourse was witchcraft accusation often occurred when a son of a wealthy family wanted to marry a woman from poor family, and in this case, the mother of that woman was often proclaimed to be a witch, who made some witchcraft in order for the son of their wealthy family to fall in love with this poor girl, and so on. Or in case of rivalry, of course, and accusation of witchcraft could also redefine, social position, lower the social prestige of a certain person, and similar.
Yeah, so it's a very, very various ways that you can
definitely
you can use it.
Yeah, definitely.
Did you, when you were conducting this work, so I understood that people talked about these experiences, but did you ever speak with a witch? Anyone who would admit using witchcraft, or who knew at least that they were blamed of witchcraft?
Well, nobody would ever admit that they used witchcraft. There is no such thing, you know. If they admitted that they used witchcraft, this would immediately ruin their social position, probably forever, right?
Yeah.
Of course, you know, I could sometimes realize that some people did indeed practice some sort of magic practices. Like one thing that I mentioned before was burying objects, usually eggs or bones, to neighbors' property. And while they would never admit that they buried a certain object to their neighbor's property first, they did sometimes admit that they buried it as a response for the buried object they found in their property, you know. And so they assumed that it came from a certain neighbor with who they were probably in some conflict or tense relationships. And they just threw it back to their property or buried it back to their property. So obviously, you know, something was going on. But I only received several admission of this kind, and never as, you know, being the first perpetrator, but always as a response to the act that was done before. Anyway, I did also hear about several women, that had a reputation of being a witch in the community, and I did interview them, and I tried to make them tell me that they were aware of the reputation, but I was never successful. Nobody actually ever admitted that they knew about their reputation, and I'm not really sure if they knew or not. I often got an impression that they didn't, but I do not dare to claim, because, you know, it's a difficult thing, I guess, to admit that people treat you as the witch, right? And well, I heard also about some circumstances in which people overtly told some women in the community that they were witch, like especially when they were drunk, you know, they would just say them to their face, you know, you're a witch or something. Otherwise, generally, they would try to avoid blaming directly, because if it was a village witch, they feared that she would revenge, do some witchcraft. And if it was a neighborhood witch, they always said, well, you never know, you can never be sure, you can suspect this or that neighbor, but you can never be sure because you never actually saw them doing some bewitchment, making some bewitchment. So, yeah, they never really dared blaming them overtly.
It also brings to mind, perhaps if you would, especially with this neighborhood witch case, if you would blame directly, could it maybe take away from the functioning of the accusation dynamic? So, because if you blame directly, perhaps then it can be disputed more easily or refuted that this is not the case. It could change the dynamics of how the accusations work.
Yes, it could. Yes, on one way it could, but also, you know, you would be in the position of the accuser, and yes, if you did not get the public, how could I say, support in this case, right? You could end up as, perhaps not as a witch, but in fact, you could end up with your social position again being lowered, because, you know, you did something that you were not supposed to do, and if you did not have any proofs of their bewitching activities, then see, how could you do it? So, you know.
Yeah. And the evidence would be difficult to produce.
Oh, definitely, yes.
So that would be a high risk thing to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I understand that there are no unwitchers in the region anymore. So it was simply in the stories about.
Yeah, well, you see, there was a very famous unwitching family that provided services for people in this region. And this family the starter of the family's business was a certain woman who was born at the beginning of the 19th century, and then the profession was continued by her son, and after her son died during the World War II, it was continued by his widow. And that last in line of these famous fortune tellers actually died at the beginning of 80s. I was lucky to find her grandson, who actually lived with her when he was a child, and observed her working. But anyway, he told me that already in the 70s, she started losing her clients. That by her job, actually had no job anymore at the end of the 70s, and at the beginning of 80s she died. So no, basically there are no traditional unwitchers in the region anymore. I know that there was another unwitcher who was practicing and actually offering similar services to the clients, living quite nearby. But obviously she did not use the same discourse. She did not, continue to work on counteracting witches. Instead, she used the term enemy, which is much more general idea. So I guess she was able to continue with this work, and she focused much more on fortune telling in general, not on unwitching procedure as such.
Mm.
But of course, nowadays people can just, turn to New Age therapists, which are often, especially in bigger cities, in urban, communities. So, and they actually do this nowadays. They go to New Age therapists. I'm not sure about people from my region. I did not ask them about that, but I actually recently conducted an interview with a woman, an educated woman, an intelligent woman living quite close to this region, who actually experienced the same type of bewitchment, obviously, as was generally proclaimed to be, the main sort of bewitchment in our region. That was, she kept finding eggs buried in her property, and she indeed turned to a New Age therapist in Ljubljana. This was a kind of a Taoistic therapist, or dealing something with Taoistic crystal therapy, and helped her clients with some angels blessing, and did angel therapy, etc. So it was not a traditional unwitcher, but a New Age therapist who, in a way, took over the work of traditional unwitchers.
So was the procedure the same?
Yeah.
Or?
It was very similar in many regards, but there were also differences in her discourse in relation to the unwitcher's discourse. Well, first he would admit, just like traditional unwitchers, that not admit, but she would confirm that it was that something was done, which was a typical way of discourse, typical discursive expression in the region that related to bewitchment, really. I mean, that somebody bewitched you in a way. Although she definitely denied the involvement of witchcraft. So she said there is no such thing as witchcraft. Anyway, she admitted, she confirmed that this was done by a certain person who wishes bad to this woman that I made an interview with. And she also tried to annihilate the bewitchment. Now it should be the bewitchment in inverted commas, right? She gave her some angels' blessings in order to annihilate the harm that was being done. But the basic difference was that instead of trying to help the client identify their witch, which was really crucial thing in the traditional therapist, traditional unwitcher's procedure, she actually redirected the blame from the outside witch to one's own body and mind. So actually, she said, we should not condemn anyone, it doesn't matter. There are people, she vaguely admitted there are people who wish us bad, who are envious, etc. But basically, she redirected the blame to ourselves. So it is us who have to actually, it was that woman that I talked to actually. So it is, I can say generally us. We have to purify ourselves. We have to meditate. We have to strengthen our energy, etc. And when we do that, no one could blame us anymore. So there's this basic difference, I think, that, from finding and searching for the perpetrator on the outside and finding the witch in our side, inside, within us, right? The change in this New Age discourse. And of course, I think this got a lot to do with the changes also that happened in the Western neoliberal society, where we are actually encouraged to think of our own lives, our own health, our own well-being as something that are entirely under our own control, right? It's ourselves who are responsible for this. And it's entirely in our hands. We have to look at our own lives as an artistic product or an enterprise, right? So, and we cannot actually obtain relief anymore by blaming someone on the outside for our misfailures. Instead, we became trained to search for the one who is to blame for any misfortune that befell us in ourselves.
Yeah, that's so that would be this kind of, on one hand it continues, but it changes shape and changes actually, also.
It adapts to the demands of this new neoliberal capitalistic society that we live in nowadays, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, it's the same thing. I mean, you can call it witchcraft, or you cannot call it witchcraft. Basically, it's just the transformation, it's adaptation, but it is a continuation too.
Yeah. Thank you. This has been very interesting.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us today.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that, Hannah. It was wonderful to hear your voice again, and great to have such a fascinating interview covering both a subject area and a geographical region that have been somewhat neglected on the RSP, although folk would be directed towards our interview with, I think it was Philip Ammon, and I also think it was Jack Sonnet recorded a good while back for us on witchcraft in, I think it was early medieval England or something. Indeed. I'd have to dig back into the archives myself, but search for Philip Ammon and you'll get a fantastic listen there. And there's also our various interviews on vernacular religion and these kind of things. Exactly. Thanks also to the BASR, NAASR and IHR for their fantastic ongoing sponsorship. Now, attentive subscribers to the RSP may have noticed over the past few weeks and months that when you go back into a page on the website with a podcast, there's some additional material there. Yes, we have finally managed to get transcriptions in place. Something we've done on an ad hoc basis in the past, but thanks to the amazing work of Helen Bradstock, we now have a transcription every single week, and we are endeavouring to have that transcription up with the episode for you on a Monday. And this is a very important thing for us, not only because it helps people search the material, and makes it easier to reference and to cite, but also for teaching purposes. One thing I discovered when using podcasts in teaching is that people would often spell the names wrong in the books and things because they were just hearing it. Having it written down makes, solves that problem, but also for people who have difficulty with the accents, or for whom listening to podcasts isn't really an option for whatever reason.
Yeah, and so it's opening up the RSP a bit more. If your first language isn't English, it could be much easier to deal with the transcription, and indeed you can use wonderful Google Translate and things on it, which isn't fantastic, but it's one broader step in our march forward to world domination and world accessibility for religious studies. So thanks to Helen for that. And as we say, this week is probably going to be the first one where it's going to be going out with the podcast. Is that correct?
No, last week was the first one. Yeah, the James Capello one from last week had the transcription with it right there. If you find these transcriptions useful, do consider either volunteering to do a transcription yourself. A couple of hours work could be a permanent contribution to the study of religion and helping out other people such as yourself, or consider contributing to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/projectrs. If you want to donate a couple of quid, anything that you wanted to contribute there will help us out enormously and help pay for these transcriptions going forward.
And of course, you can also use our other means of supporting us, which are our Amazon links, amazon.com.co.uk and .ca. If you use those websites at all to buy anything, if you click through from the links on our website, we'll get a percentage of the sale. Of course, I've got to remind you, Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, Google+, YouTube, and the YouTube links are now being embedded in the pages on the website as well. But another thing to remind you about is to come back next week for a videoed roundtable conversation facilitated by my colleague here, David Robertson, on millennialism and violence with Eileen Barker, Mirjam Mencej, Joseph Webster, and Tristan Sturm. I'm looking forward to that.
Indeed, the first episode that we recorded at the recent Sensam conference on millennialism and violence. So come back for that next week. But until then,
thanks for listening.